Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, ladies and gentlemen, I switch to English because it's going to be an English discussion. I want to welcome you here in the Burgtheater, and I want to welcome you in the name of the organizations who are putting together this event for you already since around 12 years. It's der Standard, das Burgtheater, das Institut für die Wissenschaften von Menschen und die Erste Stiftung. My name is Boris Marte and I have the honor to lead the Erste Foundation. As we sit here, the theater of Mariupol has been destroyed. And there are probably still about 100 people being shut inside the theater. Most of them probably even children. What we experienced those days is not a special kind of operation. I even have a hard time to understand that this is war. This is crime against humanity in its full dimension. And we have to understand this correctly to know how we can think about it. Now, opening up a discourse about Europe, we all thought the topics might be easier, but the topics of today go very, very deep. And I don't know how you feel, but every day I wake up, I hope that this is just a dream. And, you know, got all this sadness and fury inside myself, looking at the pictures we all get transmitted on our smartphones. So I'm very happy that today we can reflect on what is going on with such a great lineup of personalities. And let me end maybe with one word of commemoration, because one of our great personalities of Austrian politics has passed away last week. He was one of the really true visitors of this event since the beginning, Erhard Busek. And he gave basically his whole life to the question of bringing people together, understanding Central and Eastern Europe with its full historical dimensions and disruptions, and preaching to us all the time about how important it is to have more understanding between the nations in Europe. I also want to thank Ivan Vejvoda for taking up the moderation in his professional way, as he always does, also today. And in Erhard, we really lost a friend, also a friend of Erste Foundation, who has followed our work since a very long time. We have devoted some substantial funds in the last week to all the NGOs and organizations who are on the border of Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, doing a fantastic job to welcome all the refugees from the Ukraine and to give them the first shelter after they have reached the border. Talking to those people every day, basically, how intense this is, and we have to get prepared as Europe. There might be still 1 million, 2 million, maybe 4 million, maybe 5 million of people coming in the next weeks and months ahead of us. So I really want to welcome you all in the name of the organizations who put this discourse for Europe together. And you know, it's hard to wish you now it's hard to tell you enjoy the discussion or gute Unterhaltung wünschen, geht in diesen Tagen sehr schwer. But we stand with Ukraine. Thank you for coming.
Dear audience, ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome here in the Burgtheater. Ich bin die stellvertretende künstlerische Direktorin des Burgtheaters. Mein Name ist Alexandra Althoff. Ich möchte Sie herzlich begrüßen zu dieser Veranstaltung, die uns wirklich sehr am Herzen liegt. Ich bin auch sehr dankbar, dass nach allen Zensuren für soziale Zusammenkünfte es möglich ist, in der Gemeinschaft des Publikums diese Expertenrunde international hochkarätig besetzt, mal wieder, wie es auch in der Vergangenheit und in der Zukunft sein wird, zu erleben und sich damit auseinanderzusetzen und das dann in die Stadt zu tragen. Das ist sehr wichtig in diesen Tagen. Ich möchte noch darauf hinweisen, dass wir zusammen mit unseren Kooperationspartnern uns auf dieses Thema geeinigt haben für den heutigen Tag. Da war es Januar und in der gedruckten Version des Leporellos steht auch noch wieder Krieg in Europa mit einem Fragezeichen. Das heißt, für viele Expertinnen und Experten war dieser Kriegsausbruch keine Überraschung, wiewohl es natürlich zutiefst schockierend ist, jeden Tag wieder. Und auch wenn es jetzt ein Thema ist, was natürlich auf allen Kanälen 24/7 diskutiert wird, haben wir hier die Möglichkeit, analog und unvermittelt zusammenzufinden und uns ohne jegliche Ablenkung auf diese Runde zu konzentrieren. Wir haben vor genau einer Woche auf dieser Bühne eine Benefizveranstaltung machen können und zusammen mit unserem Kooperationspartner der Volkshilfe Wien und deren Partnerorganisation in der Ukraine. Wir haben über 21.000 € einnehmen können und wir haben auch von der Volkshilfe Wien überall an den Garderoben, bei den Eingängen Spendenboxen aufgestellt. Jede noch so kleine Gabe kommt direkt vor Ort, auch bei den Binnenflüchtlingen an. Wir haben dort auch in den letzten Tagen die 10.000 € Marke überschritten. Dafür bin ich Ihnen auch sehr dankbar und möchte Sie gerne dazu auffordern, auch zu spenden und bin froh, dass wir hier heute zusammenkommen können und eröffne jetzt die Runde für die Experten. Vielen Dank.
A very warm welcome to you in this very sad moment of world history and European history. It's the first day of spring, a rather chilly day, but not very much spring atmosphere in our individual lives, in the life of Europe, but in particular in the life of Ukrainians who are suffering and dying and escaping as we speak every minute of this discussion here. When with our partners we decided to address this topic somewhere in November, December, we put this title with a question mark, again question mark. Of course, needless to say, that question mark dropped off on February the 24th. We are today in the 24th day of this war, in fact, of this invasion by a country called Russia, which is a nuclear power of 150 million people, attacking a sovereign European state called Ukraine, completely unprovoked, with no reason other than neo-imperial reasons of a return to some past times that we all thought laid behind us. But before we engage in the discussion, let me introduce our panelists, and I will do it in alphabetical order. First, to my left, Catherine Kluver-Ashbrook, who is a political scientist who at Harvard led a program on diplomacy, recently was the head of the German Council on Foreign Relations, and is today a senior fellow at the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin. Please welcome Catherine Kluwer. To my right, Christine Ockrent, a renowned French journalist and writer. She is a senior producer at France Culture Radio. Full disclosure, I'm an avid listener to her Saturday morning foreign policy debate. Those of you who speak French, tune in at 11 on Saturdays. Welcome, Christine Ockrent. Next to Catherine Kluwer-Ashbrook is Ambassador Thomas Meyer-Harting, a former Austrian and EU diplomat. He was an ambassador of Austria to the United Nations and also the EU ambassador to the United Nations, and then in Brussels at the EU, the managing director for Europe and Central Asia, where he tackled the relations as well with Russia and Central Asia, and thus of Ukraine as well. Welcome, Ambassador Thomas Meyer-Harting. Our Ukrainian speaker today is our friend and colleague Serhiy Plokhy, professor of history, director of the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University, a renowned author of many books on Chernobyl, but also a book called Yalta, The Price of Peace. We will be talking about the price of peace here. Serhiy is also a senior fellow currently in Vienna at the Institute for Human Sciences. Welcome, Serhiy. And last but not least, but our friend and colleague, Professor Dariusz Tola, who is a professor of history at the Institute for Political Studies at the Polish Academy of Sciences. He was also the director of the Museum of History of Polish Jews for about 6 years. And Dariusz is also a member of the governing board of the Institute for Human Sciences. Welcome, Dariusz. Let me briefly set the scene, although Boris Marte and our colleague from the Burgtheater have said a few things, to put us in this issue of the nightmare that we are living in. It is a true nightmare. After World War II, the slogan was never again, and that's why we have this again in the title. Wars actually never ended. I come from a country that no longer exists, Yugoslavia, that ended its existence in war and has become 7 countries. We lived through a bombing and through destruction, refugees, and many victims. And the city of Sarajevo lived through a siege that lasted 1,400 days plus. The countries of Western Europe, where peace has been held for 70 years, as often the saying goes, in fact led wars. In fact, today or yesterday, and Christine will know better, we commemorate the 60th anniversary of the end of the war in Algeria. France, a Western European nation, conducted a war. Portugal, a European NATO nation, conducted wars until the middle 70s in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. And so even though we have had the fortune to live in this Europe without war, the other part of Europe was invaded by the Soviet Union, Hungary in '56, Czechoslovakia in 1968, and my own country imploded at the end of the 20th century when war should not have happened again, and we thought we were out of it. So all this to say that unfortunately somehow wars are with us, and this invasion by Russia, which frankly nobody rational expected, or expected some small military incursion into the regions of the Donbass and Luhansk, is something of a nightmare that has become true. The dream of a peaceful Europe, and Europe is a peace project first and foremost, and that's why we, who are not yet countries of Europe, like Serbia, want to join Europe. We want to join the peace project. And somehow Europe has had to wake up. This event of February 24th, I liken to the event of the fall of the Berlin Wall. It is a game-changing event where our lives, the lives of our societies change in the matter of hours, and we have to completely address the world in a different way. We are in a new era of insecurity. We are here, obviously, try and make a better future, but in the immediate, we are trying to salvage what we have. And so all of these topics, we will not try to get into Vladimir Putin's head, although I think that's unavoidable at some point. We will try and see what the fate of Europe is about. We will debate these issues, but we will have constantly in mind the fate of the Ukrainian nation and the Ukrainian people. And that's why we'll go to Serhii for a first question about this civilizational mission, quote unquote, that Russia and Putin are engaged in to try and, as they say, denazify and demilitarize your country and your people. Serhii.
Thank you, Ivan, for this introduction. Indeed, we are dealing with the unprovoked war, and despite the fact that the wars in Europe didn't end in 1945, this is certainly, in terms of the use of the ground troops, is the largest war in Europe since the end of the Second World War, and indeed a game changer in many ways. This is very clear now that the post-Cold War era ended. We are facing a new reality. And the question is why? I understand the question that was posed to me was about why we are in this situation, what are the driving forces. And originally the war, as there were some expectations certainly at the end of the last year, the war was, or potential war, was framed in the context of the NATO expansion. Unanswered remained the question of why now? What did NATO do recently to provoke that? And the second question was whether Russia was really serious about negotiation with NATO, because when in December the set of demands was put forward, it was clear that Russia was not interested in negotiation. It was very clear that the war, either big or small war, would actually worsen the Russian security situation in terms of mobilizing NATO. That was obvious. So if not NATO, then what? And that's where I want to talk really about this quote-unquote civilizational mission. Because a good part of President Putin's pronouncements were about history, and were about the Russians and Ukrainians being one and the same people. And what that means is really that Ukraine, historically and otherwise, has no right to exist. That's where the ideas of denazification also coming from, which sound at least bizarre, thinking that this is a democratic nation led by a Jewish president, the only Jewish president outside of Israel. The military forces are led by a Jewish by background Minister of Defense, and so on and so forth. So the question of Russians and Ukrainians not being allegedly separate nations or groups bring us deeper in history, really into the history of the 19th century, because that was the model of the Russian imperial thinking of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. That Ukrainians or Little Russians were part of Russian nation. In Austria-Hungary, where part of Ukraine was at that time, the Ukrainians were developing their culture and publications. In Russia, for 40 years, for more than 40 years, the publications in Ukrainian were prohibited from 1863 all the way to the beginning of the 20th century. So we are seeing here a return of empire, return of imperial thinking, and what Ivan was talking about, the wars, colonial wars, wars that accompanied the fall of the empires. This is also, in my opinion, at least the right framework to look at this war, because the origins of it are in this resentment. And you can hear that from Putin's pronouncements, from his speeches about what happened in 1991, when arguably the last European empire, the Soviet Union, certainly inherited the imperial project from Russia, from Russian Empire, when it fell apart. The Soviet Union was dissolved 1 week after the Ukrainian referendum for independence. 92% of people who participated in the referendum, voted for independence. The question that they answered was the question whether they wanted their country to be independent, not whether they wanted or not the continuation of the Soviet Union. But the USSR was dissolved 1 week after Ukrainians said no to the new union project. And the reason for that was that Ukraine was the second largest Soviet republic. Without it, Russia was not interested in continuation of the union project. But Russia never gave up on the idea that it has to control the post-Soviet space, one way or another. There is no difference in thinking between Yeltsin and Putin. There is a difference in the way actually how that issue of the control over the post-Soviet space is approached, because what Putin brought to the table was the use of the military force outside of the borders of Russian Federation. The war that we are talking about today is actually not a new war. The war started in 2014 and was actually not noticed much. It started with the annexation of the Crimea, the first takeover by another state of a territory of another sovereign state since the end of World War II in Europe, not in the world, but in Europe. And that was looked at as a bump toward the actually better and improved relations with Russia. Then the hybrid war started in Ukraine and creation of the two puppet statelets that were now recognized as a step toward the war as allegedly independent states. And again, there was very little done in terms of the reaction of the world. The current all-out war really is a major wake-up call to Europe, to the world, and we see that actually this wake-up call produced a very different reaction. My personal belief is that if the world had that reaction back in 2008, when Russian troops invaded Georgia, when the world had that kind of a reaction in 2014 when the Crimea was taken over by allegedly not Russian troops, or later when the war started in eastern Ukraine, we would not be today in this situation. But the only way to preclude even worse is actually stand united against aggression in Europe. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Sergei. Obviously, much to say with Putin's Munich Security Conference speech in 2007, when it was clear that he was changing optics. He became a historian, quote unquote, last July when he wrote this big piece about the unity of these two people. But we'll maybe come back to that. Christine, let me turn to you now. Sergei rightly mentioned the invasion and the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and there were 14,000 people who died in the meantime. Do you think that Europe was complacent at that moment, thinking that that would be it? And given that France is holding the presidency and President Macron has made several attempts and is continuing, obviously, I think, in coordination with President Zelensky to try and find a way forward, how is it that Europe, as the kind of cliche goes, being a vegetarian power, has to address carnivores, and should we start eating meat now?
Well, I think it's, as indeed has been explained, I think it is a lesson that we have chosen for 8 years to turn away from what was happening in the Donbass, from the dead and the wounded. We would call it a frozen conflict, you know, that easy wording which allows think tankers just to keep discussing with great concepts. But I think when it comes to the war today, with indeed the extraordinary and legitimate wave of emotion sweeping through Europe, it really compels our leaders to take into account the real nature of Putin's power. And when it comes to Emmanuel Macron, it's quite a cruel experience for his own idea of trying to establish a personal relationship with a Russian leader. When Macron was elected in 2017, he invited Putin to the great pomp of Versailles, walking the Galerie de Glace, and so that from one empire to the other, former French empire, you know, the status of both leaders would be accounted for. Then Macron tried to convince his own diplomacy, the Quai d'Orsay, traditionally quite distrustful of their Russian counterparts, that indeed they were wrong, and that France had to open the way to a warmer relation to Putin. Putin was invited to Brégançon, which is the holiday spot of the French presidency. That didn't work out. And so, as Macron, who, like any French president, is always eager to prove that France is still a world power, the status of a world power.
And now the only nuclear power.
And now, indeed, even if the Brits have somehow joined forces, but that's another issue. Now that Macron happens to be the head of what is called, quite wrongly, the European Council, although it's mostly a hospitality job. It has less power since the Lisbon Treaty than before. But still, Macron is, of course, using this role to try and lead European efforts. So he's been talking to Putin quite extensively. But what is interesting is the choreography. Macron spoke to Putin yesterday for 1 hour and 10 minutes. The Élysée is always quite precise about you know, the duration and the content of the conversation. This time around, no details at all, except that Macron insisted, of course, on the fate of Mariupol. But the choreography is such that Macron had spoken to Zelensky the day before. And throughout the past horrid 3 weeks, there has been a very careful, and if I may say so with a touch of irony, very un-French care of coordination. Coordination with the German Chancellor, coordination with Charles Michel, who is the real head of the European Council, former Belgian Prime Minister, coordination with Biden, in order to try and expel the Gaullist ghost of the French always doing things on their own and pretending that they will solve everybody's problems. So Macron has been very careful to actually coordinate. And that brings me, if I may, Van, to my second point, in a way. What has this war done to Macron himself? Because in 3 weeks, we'll have the first round of our presidential election. And it is interesting that Macron's stature, of course, has benefited, although he was already quite ahead of his opponents. But the war actually vindicates Macron's ambitions and, if I may, his vision for Europe, a much more coherent, cohesive Europe than ever before. Let's hope that goes on, even if our efforts are limited, too limited. A greater, a more open vision of NATO, NATO, which the same Macron, in an interview to The Economist in 2019, described as being brain dead. Now, NATO is obviously in full revival mode, although, again, we all know the limitations of its actions, and, of course, the impact of a war on our presidential debate, but that's a domestic issue, and that's not our topic today.
Thank you very much, Christine. Many things to go back to, and as the adage goes, Europe advances through crises. That was Jean Monnet's, I guess, thing, and maybe we will see, and in fact, in the reaction of Europe, we have seen a much more robust, probably the first time such a robust response. Thomas, as a diplomat and somebody who's been at the UN, I'm tempted to ask you whether the UN is brain dead, but let me ask you about the Austrian position at this moment in terms of a country that is famous for its neutrality, as is the case of Sweden and Finland, both non-NATO members as Austria is.
Well, let me first of all say on the subject of the United Nations, we know what the situation in the Security Council is if a member of the Security Council, a permanent member, is waging a war of aggression. But I do think we shouldn't forget the very clear vote in the General Assembly where more than 140 countries of the world supported Ukraine and condemned what is going on. And Russia had practically no support in that assembly. When it comes to Austria, let me start by saying that when the Austrian parliament voted neutrality, military neutrality, in October 1955, the chancellor of the day, Chancellor Julius Raab, said, this is military neutrality, this is about military neutrality, this is not about ideological neutrality. And it was clear that we chose to be a member of the family of Western European democracies and have stayed so ever since. And there can be no political neutrality, there can be no neutrality of values when it comes to judging aggression, when it comes to judging major violations of humanitarian law as we are facing, as we are witnessing right now in Ukraine. This was the position of Austria in '56. This was the position of Austria in '68. This was the position of Austria in the early '80s when martial law was established in Poland. And this is the position of Austria today. And I think everybody who heard what the president of Austria had to say on the subject yesterday in this massive event in support of Ukraine saw this and understood this again. Let me also say that one factor that has greatly affected the way we operate, even as a military neutral country, was joining the European Union in 1995. We made very clear that we will fully support, in a spirit of solidarity, decisions in the framework of common foreign and security policy. And we made the necessary constitutional adaptations to do so. And without going into further details, I think it's worth noting that, as you saw, Austria allows the transit of military equipment through Austrian territory and through Austrian airspace based on the decisions taken by the Council of the European Union on this subject. So much for the moment on Austrian neutrality. The other angle, of course, is whether neutrality is potentially a model for Ukraine. And this is something that has been discussed in recent days. Now, obviously, Austrian neutrality developed in a very specific geopolitical context in the 1950s. We have a discussion of our own, what this means today for Austrian neutrality, but this is something that we may perhaps return to later. And obviously it's up to Ukraine to decide whether that is a sort of model that fits for Ukraine now. When I listen to what Ukrainians, including President Zelensky, say, it's clear that they have come to the conclusion that membership in NATO is not in the cards for Ukraine now and not in the foreseeable future, and they're no longer aiming to become a member of NATO. But on the other hand, what they do clearly need is security guarantees, even if they are non-allied. And this is something that they're discussing seriously. They had security guarantees in the Budapest Memorandum of '94, which didn't work. And I think that any solution, even a solution for a non-allied Ukraine, will have to take that into account if it is a solution that is to be accepted by the Ukrainians.
And did I understand correctly that Austria will increase its defense spending, or is this just a forethought that needs to be decided
Well,
upon?
I think this has been announced. As I said, I think there are all sorts of considerations that need to be made about what everything that is happening right now means for Austria and Austrian security policy, but I think we should return to that at a later stage.
And I have been remiss in thanking Thomas Meyer-Harting because he stepped in at the very last moment. Ambassador Martin Seidik unfortunately got COVID and had to renounce presentation. So thank you again for that,
We worked together
Thomas.
in Moscow in the 80s, so we've known each other for a long
Maybe
time.
we can come back to your Moscow days. Catherine, let me turn to you. The United States clearly is not only one of the key actors in the transatlantic relationship, it is, for all intents and purposes, a European actor, and Europe has been able to grow and prosper under the American security umbrella within NATO. We'll come back to the issue of strategic autonomy of Europe. There has been the nuclear threat. Putin has raised that. How do you see the role of the United States in regard to this moment? We saw there was that famous Geneva meeting between Putin and Biden. That clearly didn't lead to anything. Where do you see the United States currently?
Well, I think, first of all, what the last few weeks have made indelibly clear is that the United States remains a European power and remains a transatlanticist power, but also one that has, and this administration made that very clear, of course, its sights set on thinking about great power competition in a global way. And that without the United States, both active in the European theater and in the Asian theater, you're never going to be able to rethink the fundamental question that underlies this panel discussion this morning, is what is the future of global order? How do we focus on maintaining relations between particularly the great powers who now have access to a much different war chest? I completely agree with Serhi that what we're seeing is effectively a 19th century conflict on first look, where it's about territory, spheres of influence. We have used a 20th century system that we built for ourselves after the last cataclysmic war in the heart of Europe to arbiter this, but over time that system has become so hollowed out, so perverted, and Ivan Krastev, who's in the front row, has written beautifully about just how we've in German we would say Raubbau, we've bled some of that system out, and now we're in a 21st century, we're dealing with 21st century consequences that, for the European sovereigntist, want it or not, cannot be mitigated by Europe alone, because the fact that the United States more or less immediately was able to do what was necessary, which is the mobilization of arms, the mobilization of funds, the idea that it can move soldiers quickly into still existing military bases around Europe in the way that it can, the way that it can focus NATO nation and European nations such that we now have, and my other passport is German, in Germany really a Zeitenwende, a real shift of perspective and action, that all is due to the fact that America remains an anchor power, but that we also see members of the Quad, Japan and Australia, stepping up not only to say we have solidarity with what is going on in the European theater, but we're willing to send liquefied natural gas to Europe if necessary. That you see a heightened diplomacy by Americans with China, with Venezuela, and we can discuss what's behind that and what the point is of that. But the fact that the Americans then have to, or are in a position where they can take that step back and look at how the knock-on effects in the, what is essentially a borderless world now. Because again, we're dealing with a food crisis, we're dealing with an oil and gas crisis, we're dealing with a migrant crisis of unforeseen dimensions, a humanitarian crisis, that the United States really does need to then continue to step up. And it's having the shifting effects internationally, that the pressure that the United States can bring on the rogue states that didn't vote in the Security Council or abstained, that is a strong diplomatic lever still that the United States can play. But it's also having interesting effects within the United States, particularly within the Republican Party. And we mentioned a French election cycle. Of course, we have an American election cycle coming up as well. And I think everybody in this room is grateful that the President of the United States is now Joe Biden and not Donald Trump, because that was, of course, an ace that Vladimir Putin tried to play initially, was that he would play Donald Trump so that Donald Trump would destroy the Western security architecture from the inside. That was not successful. But what does that mean going forward? And it's interesting to see also the dimensions that has going into a congressional election, because the GOP now has to ask itself some really difficult questions about where it positions itself vis-a-vis the Russian dictator, but also vis-a-vis its own thinking of security posture. So the United States is back as an Atlantic power, but how the Europeans pick that up and how they use this rapid shift that has gone on since effectively February 24th. And I think nothing's more emblematic than, I was at the Munich Security Conference on Sunday, is now the panel structure that is anchored on Europe. And you had the French defense minister and the European foreign minister sit on the panel there and say, well, yes, we have all these wonderful instruments, but they're so new within the European Union, PESCO and CARD and what have you not, all the acronym soup that Europe is so famous for, but we can't quite use them yet, and it's so new, and we shouldn't rely on them. And a week and a half later, finances were no longer an issue, military rearmament and changes were no longer an issue, purchasing questions, down to the F-35, suddenly became sort of a non-argument. So what will be important to see is both how the Europeans and the Americans can take this forward, whether that unity can be preserved, and here I'm perhaps more critical and fearful than some others, but then also what the Europeans do with that going forward, and then conversely, if together we are aware enough and willing enough to look at the failures that we committed together over the course of these last 3 decades in letting our joint international system atrophy in the way that we have, and allowing these sequential violations by authoritarian powers and our own, because frankly, we abuse the system just as much for the convenience of our economics, our growth, our prosperity, if we are willing and able to be honest with us such that we're able to rethink and rebuild a system that can work for the future.
Absolutely. I think we need to keep repeating this argument about the complacency that somehow after '89, the end of history came, which of course it didn't, because the Yugoslav wars were full history immediately in 1991. And then this illusion that, in the famous words of Montesquieu, the French philosopher, that the commerce would have le doux effet du commerce, that commerce would somehow ease everything up. Mm-hmm. And both Ivan and Mark Leonard and so many others have talked about the fact of the interdependency of commerce and investments would somehow bring everyone together. To the contrary, in fact, we have seen the rise of China, we have seen what Russia is doing, and there is a new world of sovereignism, and maybe we can come back to that bigger issue as well. But you're right to point to the energy, to the food crisis, which are dramatically confronting and threatening literally the coming months and the next year. Dariusz, last but not least, you are from a frontline country in this event, and Poland has been, with the Baltic nations, most vociferous in a positive way about the dangers that Russia poses throughout these past decades, and NATO has somehow been responsive in a certain way. But now you bear the brunt of 2.2 million refugees in the span of 3 weeks. This is probably, I don't know whether it's appropriate to say a world record, but simply the most dramatic refugee crisis that we have seen. I'm sure that many of these people hope that they will return soon, but that is, we know, something that's a crystal ball question. How is Poland coping, and what are you hearing now that you're in Vienna from your friends around Poland?
So first, you've mentioned that Poland and the Baltic states are on the forefront in demanding sanctions and active measures towards Russia. Let me respond to the argument that it was the NATO expansion that is the root cause of the Russian aggression. I would reverse this argument, saying that if there was no NATO expansion, instead of my family hosting Ukrainian refugees in Warsaw, you would have been hosting my family in Vienna today, with equally legitimate demands of Russia to do something about Poland. So that's one argument. Second, let me stress this humanitarian or human dimension, because the human dimension of the war of the kind we are seeing in Ukraine is mass outflow of refugees, both internally displaced people and those externally displaced. More than 3 million have moved into the European Union, and most of them, more than 2 million, into Poland. This is a consequence of the type of war we see, which is indiscriminate shelling of cities, of civilian targets. And we have seen it in Chechnya, we have seen it in Syria. And the refugees do what the refugees do usually. They go to the nearest safe country, which in this case is Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Moldova. Let me stress Moldova, which is the smallest of these countries and with the lowest per capita GDP and has the highest number of Ukrainian refugees per 1,000 of population. So the burden, the humanitarian burden is the greatest in this small country, which in itself has a similar history of Transnistria, of a region under Russian control, which depopulated throughout the years when this eastern part of Moldova is under effective Russian control. Something like a half of the population has moved elsewhere. And this is what we may expect if Russian occupation of Ukraine continues. We may expect large depopulation. The same happened in the Donbas area. So people are living, even the people whom Mr. Putin claims to be liberating, the Russian speakers are living massively, clearly showing that they don't need this kind of protection. So we have large numbers of people, and in addition that, well, it's the biggest military conflict in Europe since World War II, and also is the biggest refugee movement we have seen since World War II. In 2015, when we have seen Syrian and Near East refugees coming, it was 1.3 million in 2015. Now this is the number you have in 10 days in Europe. Former Yugoslavia, the number was similar, but within 3 years. So the speed of the expansion of the refugee movement is staggering. And so far the response, at least for Poland, which I'm following closely, there has been massive grassroots response of individuals, NGOs, local governments. The central government was rather slow in responding, but I don't think it's possible to continue having such a mass of refugees only on the basis of regular human solidarity. My city, the city of Warsaw, has now more than 300,000 refugees, which makes almost 20% of the pre-war population, within 3 weeks. And the number is growing. So when we are talking here in the theater in Vienna, we have thousands and thousands of people crossing the border, some 100,000 people crossing the border on a single day. So the number is fast expanding. And I'm not sure if this is a primary Russian objective to destabilize Central and Eastern Europe with the masses of refugees, but clearly is a secondary objective. Very much when Belarus was pushing refugees from Near East across the Polish border in the last year, and also across the border of Russia with Norway, there were attempts to put of similar. It was clearly to put the leaders in Europe before a dilemma. You accept them, and then we will send them more. And when you refuse them, you will show that you're hypocrites, that all the values that you're claiming are not there. So in this case, clearly, Europeans, Poles, Slovaks, Moldovans, and others stand to the values. And the question is how long they can do it as citizens or local governments. I think there is a need for coordinated international European response to the humanitarian crisis, not to see these countries collapse under the burden of the refugee flow, which is, quite a risky situation in Moldova. But the best way to stop the expansion of the humanitarian crisis is to stop the Russian invasion. The single most important thing to do is to help Ukrainians defend themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dariusz. Clearly, the fact that Putin is putting so much pressure on all sides, and you're right to point out that the refugee crisis is certainly one of the biggest pressures, along with the brutal military aggression that is being conducted. And obviously no one needs to be reminded here that we are 600 kilometers away from the Ukrainian border. It's roughly a 5.5-hour drive. And so the fear that the Norways and the Swedens and the Baltics and others are confronted with at the moment are real. The way that people are buying iodine and various other measures in case of a nuclear attack or a tactical nuclear attack is a real return through the nightmare to the worst evil of European history. Serhii, let me ask you in that regard, both as a historian but as a Ukrainian who has family in Ukraine at the moment, what do you think is the goal of Putin at this moment? Will he stop at Ukraine's border? Will he stop at the Dniester River? Does he contemplate taking on NATO countries? I mean, he talked about going back to the 1997 situation. What is your view on this?
Well, first let me comment on the people buying iodine and the nuclear threats, because the war in Ukraine already went nuclear in a different way. The Chernobyl nuclear site was taken over during the first day after the war, with tanks moving through the exclusion zone, raising 10 times the level of radiation that has been there because of the radioactive dust. As the result of the war going in the region, the power supply being cut more than once, the emergency generators kicking in and then running out of the diesel, and then diesel was brought there. So we are already with Chernobyl alone in a situation where there can be another accident, because there is, of course, the safe confinement, 1.5 billion euro confinement that needs electricity and needs support. Monitoring, the operators are basically hostages without ability to establish contact with the family, get medication or anything of that kind. And the actual battle took place on the territory of the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, which is Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the area where I'm coming from. There was shelling, they caught fire, so the nuclear power plant is now under the Russian military control. Operators working in the conditions of stress, following the orders of the military commanders, and the Russian troops were stopped on the approaches to another nuclear power plant with 3 nuclear reactors, the southern Ukrainian nuclear power plant. And again, the war certainly is not over by any stretch of imagination. We don't know what will happen. This is the first time in history that the war is being conducted, the ground war is being conducted on the territory of the nuclear power plant. And that certainly raises big issues, not just for Ukraine. From Chernobyl, we know that radiation doesn't recognize any borders. It all depends on the direction of the wind. So I personally, when I see that people are mostly concerned about the threat of nuclear weapons, or the rising level of readiness on part of Putin, I think that actually the worries and the concerns are misplaced, because the nuclear is already part of the warfare that is happening, and this is very practical and very clear and present threat to Europe as a whole.
What is the worst case scenario on the use of the nuclear plants by Putin, beyond simply controlling them?
Well, the situation is that we are in the conditions of the war, where we can't really predict anything what can happen. The shelling of the nuclear power plant can, of course, cause a meltdown and potential new Chernobyl, but simply just cutting the power line somewhere away from the nuclear power plant and not allowing the pumps to work and cool down either the reactor that already shut down or the pool with the spent nuclear fuel, and we have that kind of a pool in the Chernobyl zone. That's the cause of Fukushima. So we have both the possibility of Chernobyl and Fukushima type of accidents taking place, and not necessarily even by design, by intent. Chernobyl forest catching fire, which is again in the conditions of the war, and in the shelling, it's basically a miracle that it didn't happen so far, right? It is radioactive. So we are in a completely new reality, and the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is housed here, the world in whole is completely unprepared to deal with those issues. Even the legislation, international legislation, is not in place. So that's again concern that I don't think, and part of the war that is not getting enough attention. And in terms of how far Putin is prepared to go, well, there is very clear that the former Soviet space is certainly considered by Putin, and that was true for Yeltsin as well, as the Russian sphere of influence. That was the Cold War ended in 1989, 1991 with agreement on a number of issues, from the Middle East to Cuba, to Afghanistan, to South Africa. There was never agreement between Moscow and Washington on what will happen in the post-Soviet space. US position always was, okay, we support the sovereignty of the new republics. The Russian position was, okay, we recognize their borders as long as they're part of our sphere of influence. And this is a long way to say that the Baltic states, which are part of NATO, which are part of European Union, are of course considered to be in Moscow part of the Russian sphere of influence. And then a lot depends on your definition of the war. Because cyber warfare, they're already being attacked more than once, not just Ukraine, but also NATO countries and EU countries. This is basically not using any kind of imagination or any kind of possible scenarios. That's already been actually stated. That's already happening.
Christine, what do you think then is the response? I mean, there's been a very robust decision on sanctions and raising the level of sanctions in all sorts of directions, but at the same time we see that the flow of gas and oil continues, and that means that dollars are flowing back to Russia as well. There's very ambitious plans, a scramble to diversify energy sources to wean oneself off from Russian gas, and there's obviously the intent to spend much more on military expenditures. So how do you see this going forward?
The gas issue is certainly the most difficult issue for the very cohesion of the European Union. Member states have indeed stuck together when it has come to imposing sanctions, increasing sanctions on most Russian banks, except those two banks which actually cater to the gas and oil outflow. And of course, it depends on the degree of dependency. It's obvious that Germany and Austria and Italy, not to mention Hungary, which has privileged contractual agreements with Putin, thanks to his friend Orban. So it's a difficult issue, but it is quite obvious that all our European countries are scrambling to find alternate sources of energy. Belgium yesterday decided to cancel the decision to get out of nuclear energy for another 10 years. Coming to realize that nuclear energy, as long as it is in safe territories, is the way out, and one way out. And France has decided, if Macron is re-elected, to increase its nuclear energy potential. But obviously, for Germany, for instance, which, as I understand, has no liquefied gas facilities at all, you can't sort of improvise that in the course of 2 weeks. So it's a very difficult issue. But it really gets back to this horrid lesson of realism that we Europeans have to build up our own defense system. Of course, within NATO, and there again, I would insist on Macron's care not to raise yet again, at least for the time being, how to articulate a common European defense within NATO. once Germany, Scholz decided to increase so spectacularly, albeit over many years, the German spending program, it was announced that immediately Germany would buy American fighter planes. Well, that, in France certainly is a little difficult swallowing. And it will be a difficult process. But it's obvious, when you look at Denmark, having a referendum on whether to build up its own defense, when you look at Finland and Sweden, Finland, the epitome of what neutrality is supposed to be, I mean, it shows that indeed, however cruel, the war in Ukraine shows us that we have to build up our own defense system. And that gets us back to the issue of cohesion. The 27 have to remain united. Is the pressure of the refugee issue, which Darius raised, and I fully subscribe to this idea that it's very much in the Kremlin's mind that it's a way to crack up our own democratic systems. And God knows if the issue of immigration has been a divisive issue within the EU. So I think we really have to try and convince our leaders, our public opinions, that it's a reset for Europe. It's yet another lesson that we have to keep united and we have to strengthen our own forces on all accounts, including information. We had this conversation this morning together as we're both interested in the media business, and it's actually a very important issue that we teach our kids from very early age how to understand what news is about. Because there again, I think we have underestimated the very long efforts of the Putin system to undermine our democracies, using the media, using COVID. Actually, I think it may be said that this war in Ukraine is the first COVID war. The fact that Putin has been so isolated, paranoid as he is of getting the disease, for 2 years, the guy has been obviously, totally isolated, even as we understand from his own first circle. So again, we have to be extremely vigilant and fight back on all the fake news, all these terrible social media mechanisms, which actually in our countries of free speech, free thinking, free expression, are a source of weakness for our own institutions and our own minds. And I think that is another war that we have to be careful about.
Indeed, I think that's an extremely important point, and we'll get to this issue. Is Putin more afraid of democracy in Ukraine than simply engaging in a territorial reconquest, or are these things combined? As Europe has looked at Russia as a spoiler, and in fact, you mentioned the Versailles meeting there, Macron did address the issue of Russia Today and Sputnik in addressing Putin. Germany has been very clear about the interference of Russian cyber in the elections, not to mention the American elections as well. And at the same time, Putin has been closing Russia more and more, forbidding non-governmental organizations, of which Memorial, of course, is the most famous, of arresting people, of killing opposition. Boris Nemtsov was killed, Navalny is in prison, there was an attempted murder by using Novichok. So it's really, people have used, it's going back to a sort of totalitarian state. We in Europe have talked about him as a spoiler, trying to show the weakness of Western democracy. And I think you're right then to say it is a battle of how do we preserve our system. And that's why I go to you, Catherine. with your German hat maybe, will Germany come back to nuclear at some point? I mean, this is about survival in the end.
Well, I think the way that you just phrased it is exactly right, because my dire wish as a European taxpayer, as a European, would be to have the extension of what Christine just mapped out, which is, if we take this idea of Jean Monnet that Europe is forged in crisis, that Europe really represent as a node the best of European solutions, as opposed to swatting away the crises that we've had in the past. We didn't have a good solution, or not a comprehensive solution, to the financial crisis in 08-09. We didn't have a comprehensive and functional solution to the migrant crisis in 2015. We didn't do the European job. And now, where the cataclysmic nature is such that it pulls on all of these strings, suddenly we're discovering what the purpose, ideally, of a nodal structure of Europe should be, which is that we have the next-gen EU funds, that we're willing to think and rethink about when or whether we ever return to the sovereign debt, the debt mechanisms that put a brake on how we think about public financing, public spending, and loans. If that is the kind of leadership creativity that this crisis unleashes, the fact that taboos are really reconsidered in a more creative and proactive way with different actors around the table, then maybe we'll find some odd silver lining in this situation. The fact that Robert Habeck, the economics minister, who was from the Green Party, put the fact that, we might consider extending the life of the very few nuclear power plants that still operate in Germany on the table, under duress. I mean, there's one politician who is really wearing the face of this crisis, and that's Robert Habeck, because as we all discussed, there are so many issues that come together in the portfolio that he heads up. The fact that he's even considering that and putting that out to the public, and I think this is Christine's sub-point, we really need to work with our publics now in a very, very different way, and which is why I'm so pleased that all of you are here, because to make these changes, to be radically creative in reshaping how the European Union deals with this, how we deal these cards in the transatlantic relationship, is going to demand that all of us not only sit up and listen, but we're much more willing to think about how our tax dollars, euros are used, and that we embrace a new form of leadership. And to Serhi's point about cyber, and I have a good colleague of mine in the audience who deals with cyber, in Valentin Weber, the reason that the cyber dimension, for instance, hasn't played a public role in this conflict is because that's one of the places where we saw the threat coming and we acted ahead of time with creative leadership. The reason that the wiper attacks that were attempted on Ukrainian satellites, on public infrastructure didn't work is because Microsoft and Google saw this coming, have seen this coming since 2015, since NotPetya, since 2017. The NATO Center of Excellence in Estonia has been all over protecting critical elements of Ukraine's critical cyber infrastructure. And so that if attacks on Ukrainian or on satellite systems begin to affect into NATO territory, we're there to meet that challenge. And we need to see, as Christine noted, in all the other public policy areas that are vital now, that that's the kind of way that we attack these problems, and not going back, quote unquote, to how we're bound into the policy making of old. And that is the only silver lining in this really cataclysmic crisis that I could see, that we jump over our shadows, and we jettison the taboos that we built for ourselves over the past 7 decades.
As our friend said in his interview to Der Spiegel, the night of the 24th of February was one where Swedish neutrality disappeared and German pacifism. Has it, and do you think that really German public will wake up to this after a long time?
I've had a long debate with key members of particularly the Social Democratic Party about this, where I've said, I think the German public and how we think about it in the German vernacular as a mündiger Bürger has been far ahead of its own polity in the country. And I think you really see this borne out in the surveys that have been done. Okay. I do think that you have seen for a long time that Germans understand that they need to play a larger role in the world. and in the willingness that they're able to shoulder the burden, because this will be a financial burden, make no mistake. Changing, away from a petro-driven system in the way that Germany is dependent on oil and gas that comes from Russia, that's going to hurt. And for for Germans to begin to understand what that's going to mean, and it won't be easy along the long path of what that is, but you need exactly that buy-in right now. And I think they have realized that to be the kind of hinge power, the middle power, and to present a strong side to other authoritarian powers as well, China too, you're going to have to change your entire posture in the world.
There's a lot of rethinking to be done, Thomas. Our country's ready to pay the price for this. Austria, among others, has investments in Russia and Ukraine. Obviously, one of your banks is in Russia as well. What do you sense, sort of reading and talking to people here? Are they ready to rethink some of these links that exist? I mean, the supply chains are obviously one of the issues. The German car industry, we know, is very dependent on a lot of the metal, aluminum,
palladium.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I'd say that if you have a discussion of what we did over the past decades was altogether wrong, I think that most Austrians would believe that it was right that we tried to engage and that we tried to diversify also economically. But it is also clear that with the dependency that we have on Russian gas, 80%, and the involvement that you mentioned with banks, it's clear that whatever happens, this will never be the same again. I mean, it will take more time for us than for others because you can't change this from one day to the next. But it seems clear to me that whatever happens in Ukraine, we will not be able to return to the situation that we had economically before the 24th of February. I would also, if you don't mind, like to make an additional point, because I don't only want to approach this from the Austrian angle, but also from the European Union one, for which I worked until, as you said, 2019. And in fact, I participated in a mission to Mariupol in 2019, where we spoke about the possibility of strengthening the regional resilience of southeastern Ukraine at the time, because that was basically what the European Union engagement was about at the time. It was about strengthening resilience and making Ukraine more able to resist the pressures it was facing. And the important change that I see now is that for the first time, the European Union is not only engaging with economic resilience, it's making a major contribution to strengthen the military resilience of Ukraine. Because I think what is at the core of our effort now, it's for the Ukrainians to decide how they want to continue this enormous and heroic resistance they are showing. It's for the Ukrainians to say how they want to continue and when they might think that they can want to make appropriate concessions. It's a decision for the Ukrainians. We cannot tell them to stop, and there are limits beyond which we cannot tell them to go on. And I think we have to support President Zelensky in his efforts to achieve a settlement, because that is what he's speaking about all the time. And for this settlement to happen, we have to strengthen the resilience of the country. And I think that is what the European Union is doing. And you mentioned Finland. I found that an interesting case, because I read an article, by the way, the other day, or an interview by Ivan Krastev, who's here in the room. You find yourself being reminded of the situation that Finland faced in 1940, when it was confronted with Soviet Russia, with the Soviet Union, which was seen as an insurmountable opponent, and it resisted. It resisted in an admirable way, which in the long term made the survival of the Finnish nation possible. This happened at a great price at the time, and as I said, the worst thing to happen now would be to force Ukraine into a situation where it capitulates. We have to strengthen the resilience of Ukraine for that not to happen, but I think it is nonetheless also an issue of survival of the Ukrainian nation.
And with your UN experience, there's this initiative that we are reading about creating a war crimes tribunal. The war crimes are being documented as we speak, and over these past 24 days, egregious crimes that have been committed. the bombing of the theater in Mariupol is just one of them. Do you think there's a chance that this initiative can go through the UN, because it could go through the General Assembly on this?
Well, you know, it so happens that my father was a representative of the UN War Crimes Commission in London and was amongst the people who prepared the legal background and did the legal work for the Nuremberg Tribunal. But that was the outcome of, as we know, the Second World War, which ended in the complete defeat of Germany. And I think what we are speaking about now, and it's an issue of sort of sequencing things, what we're speaking about now is a settlement. And I think that Arnold Schwarzenegger, in his admirable statement, said it was President Putin who began this war, and it is only President Putin who can end this war. And it's President Zelensky who is asking for direct negotiations between the President of Ukraine and the President of Russia. So I think that is the priority right now. Obviously, we cannot forget what has happened. War crimes are war crimes, but I think for the international community, the first priority right now is to achieve a settlement that is acceptable to Ukraine.
Thank you for mentioning the great Austrian Arnold Schwarzenegger. Dariusz, on this question of democracy, do you think that one of the considerations that Putin had was this issue that Ukraine would be a kind of model, however imperfect, of a democratic society where you have free elections, a more or less free press, where people have the freedom to protest, as one of the reasons to destroy what we metaphorically have called the new West Berlin, the kind of window shop where people in a closed society, in a totalitarian society, could look and give them hope that something was better. Again, we're quoting our friend very often here in the first row, but I want to repeat it because I think it's very revealing of Putin's attitude, that Putin's 9/11 was the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and that's where really he got scared to hell, if I can be very colloquial, about the way that his power could end if people power really rose in the streets of Russian cities.
Well, of course, that was one of the reasons, maybe not the most important reason, although I think the whole Ukrainian national project as an alternative to the Russian project, a project of a very different political culture, of a parliamentary democracy where people disagree and when you don't know who will be the next president, which is not the case in Russia, certainly. So I think this example of a people so culturally close, and as Mr. Putin believes, the one people of Russia and Ukraine having such a divergent path of political development in the post-communist period, I think that was a major argument. But this has also an inner EU dimension, the defense of democracy, which is the defense of the rule of law in Poland and Hungary, namely how to help Poland and Hungary helping the Ukrainian refugees without helping the populists running these countries, including my country. I think it's a challenge. It was a major problem before the war started, and I hope there will be a solution exactly along these ways. Helping Poles help Ukrainians without helping the populists. It's a bit complicated, but not more complicated than German politics, I suppose. So you can make it. Now with the Ukrainian civic nationalism having got such an important new power and unity during this war, which you can see every day, I think it's nobody else but Mr. Putin that has destroyed such a possibility of he pushed the Ukrainians westward much more than anybody else. And from a Polish point of view, where we have a difficult past of Polish-Ukrainian relations and a couple of wars, actually, this is Russia which made the Ukrainian nation so much anti-Russian and pro-Polish and pro-European. So these are, at least for a generation, this is done. These are the things you cannot reverse with any propaganda or policy. And as long as the EU maintains its unity, and it's so far more or less it has maintained, it's the only viable and attractive project, example, magnet for Ukrainians, but also for others. We shouldn't forget about the Belarusians. You know, it's quiet about Belarus now because there is war nearby. But let me remind you that just 2 years ago, we had a major crisis in Belarus due to the authoritarian nature of the regime and the Russian influence there. So the case of Belarus is not closed. So we should think first to stop the war in Ukraine and prevent further crimes committed by the Russian army. But in the next step, we should think about rebuilding Ukraine and making it a part of Europe. And that will be the best example we can give to the rest of the post-Soviet space.
Sergei, and we have about 10 minutes left. What do you think about this idea to give candidacy to Ukraine? We know that Georgia and Moldova have also applied. These are all countries where, as has been mentioned but needs to be repeated, Russia has its fingers. In Georgia, it's Abkhazia and South Ossetia. In Moldova, it's Transnistria. In Ukraine, it's the Donbass. Do you think that Europe should step up and even symbolically say, okay, you are now on a path, it's long, you may need to meet criteria, but is there a need for a stronger message from Europe of embracing Ukraine?
Well, I certainly believe that, that those are the words that should be said, and that they have to be, the European Union has to mean that. So symbolism is not good. If symbolism will be there, and the words would be said and nothing would come out of that, that would mean really not just disappointment on the part of Ukrainians, but that would be loss of trust by the European Union, by almost anybody. And that war also shows that the model that was used after the expansion of the European Union, after the expansion of NATO, when it stopped, that there can be a gray zone, that there can be a zone allegedly of cooperation, or that idea was actually killed. That idea was killed by this war in particular, by the Russian support for the Lukashenko in Belarus. So whether we like it or not, we are getting not in the new Iron Curtain, but we are getting certainly a clear division in Europe that wasn't there before. Again, it's not European choice, it's not the Ukrainian choice, it's the choice that is actually being imposed on us by this war. And what that means is that I don't think that there is actually other good solution for Europe, for Ukraine, for the quote-unquote countries in between, than actually by joining EU in particular. Again, the military situation, NATO and things like that, this is like in the case of Austrian neutrality, these things can be decoupled, they can be separated. But in terms of the political, economic, and other forms of integration, I believe that this is the only way to go now in this world that was changed on February 24th.
And Christine, you've rightly talked about cohesion, and the response of Europe has been much quicker than it has been in previous crises. Do you see the willingness to really go for a stronger, cohesive, both defense policy, but also reinforcing the economic dimensions of Europe, a banking union, strengthening the euro? We know that countries like Bulgaria and Croatia will probably join the euro soon.
Well, the process, as we know, of getting into the EU, especially now that the United Kingdom is out, let us remember that it's the Brits who insisted in those days to expand the EU rather than deepen the EU. That was Jacques Delors' famous formula. But that's past, and I fully subscribe to what you have said. I think that the last response, also in Versailles, of the EU leaders to the request of Ukraine, Moldavia, and Georgia to get in, The fact that Georgia and Moldavia asked at the same time didn't help. And again, there's this dividing line within the 27 about those issues. But it should be more than symbolic, more than words, and it should entail even more economic support and military support. Because as we speak, the dreadful reality is that people keep dying. And I think the feeling of being powerless, for us Europeans who have been so spoiled, and always, especially the French, moaning and groaning about everything, it's really, it's more than uncomfortable, it's really obscene. And again, I get back to this idea that we have to convince our public opinions that, as Catherine put it, there will be a lot of sacrifice. And it's not only paying more, to fill up your motor car. And I think that showing immediately building up, as long as we avoid the Marshall Plan expression, but if we build up a very serious economic and financial plan to support, reconstruct Ukraine, whatever the decision of the Ukrainian people, and you're absolutely right, Mr. Ambassador, it's up to them, as long as they keep alive. And but we have to show within the limitations, and we know what they are, that we cannot get into a third world war. But we have to have very concrete measures to show that we will build up Ukraine back. And that is, I think, a program which will have overwhelming support in our 27 countries.
That's absolutely fundamental. Catherine, quickly, there's a NATO summit, and Joe Biden is traveling tomorrow, right?
Yep.
What do you expect from that? I mean, is the threat that on all these fronts that we've talked about, military, refugees, economic, fear of cutting energy supplies, will there be a pushback demonstrated?
Well, in an ideal world, NATO was already doing a lot of this fundamental work in the lead up to what is supposed to be the new NATO strategic concept that comes out this summer. The idea of resilience was sort of the fundamental piece that the Secretary General kept floating out into the air, how we think about resilience in the 21st century. And one would hope that in these discussions, you're not only figuring out how to not only shore up and reinforce everything around enhanced forward presence, it's still in the air, this idea that if Russia has so egregiously violated all the agreements that we have had between NATO and Russia, that we might think about making those rotational forces permanent forces. And there's a big debate at the heart of NATO whether that would already begin to trigger, whether that would be seen as yet another provocation by the Russians, et cetera. But there are a number of key issues on the table. But NATO, as an organization, of course, has begun at least a process of that redefinition because it's had to take on so many other issues here. And I think everything that Sarah and Christine have said about economic resilience and how we expand on that thinking of economic resilience, because what we haven't touched on this morning is what would a territorial, what is the solution look like? Would we have carved out areas that then would have to be monitored, that then would have to have some sort of security presence, that would have some sort of, are we looking at an Ireland situation, like an old Ireland situation? What would that even look like? And so I think what this has been above anything for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the European Union, this has to be a lesson in humility. Because what we have done with Turkey and other, would-be states to join the European Union is for a long time, we've strung them along through, of course, the you know, the Rem Koolhaas put a physical version of the acquis communautaire at the middle of the Rond-Point Schuman in 2004 when we when we brought the Eastern partners in, and it was about 1.5 meters long or 2 meters long, and now it's probably 3.5 meters long, the obligations that we put to new member states. So the fact that now, with these 3 countries, you're going to have to think about something that the Marshall Plan is maybe off the table, but something, you know, the EU has to come to Ukraine first before Ukraine comes to the EU, and there's going to have to be a significant component to rethinking what the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is actually for. And it was already part of its process toward the June summit, but I think that has to be accelerated. And my wish would be, as a European taxpayer, that some of that thinking that we get beyond when we have these frequencies of these meetings now, that we are actually getting somewhere closer to the 30,000-foot perspective that will allow for us to do that, to begin to map out beyond the urgency that we clearly have, what that construct would look like. Because, again, we need to be mapping and need to be doing it very creatively what the physical, geographical possible solutions that Europeans, through the kind of leadership that Vladimir Zelensky has shown, can truthfully put on the table. Because right now, at least publicly, it's my impression, I don't know about you, is we're not even wagering enough to sketch that for our publics. And I think that's fundamentally dangerous because that's where we need to bring them along.
Yeah, obviously this cannot be a solution of the type of the Dayton Peace Agreement, where the United States brought the warring parties in Bosnia into an Air Force base, locked them in to Ohio for 2 or 3 weeks, and then this is a nuclear power. It's a completely different ballgame to discuss. Thomas, do you see, you know, when you, in your fleeting moments, how do you see the conclusion to this?
I think we have a long way to go. But as I said, any solution that doesn't safeguard the survival of Ukraine under conditions that are acceptable to Ukraine is not a sustainable solution over long. I mean, we've discussed, I mean, the media have discussed the possibility of Russia occupying the country. I mean, they're facing the difficulties that we're seeing right now. I mean, a situation where they would want to maintain this over a long period is, in my opinion, not sustainable. They have been, this war started with the intention of liberating Russians living in Ukraine, and the Russian army has been stuck now for nearly 4 weeks, a few kilometers from the Russian border, in front of a city entirely inhabited by Russian speakers, all of which want to remain Ukrainian. And I think that is the challenge that you would face if you don't have a settlement. If you don't mind, I would just like to say also one short word, because I promised to say so, on what the consequences of this might be for our own reflection and for Austrian reflection when it comes to Austrian security. I mean, you know, of course, that in Austria, the 2 values to which the population is probably most strongly committed is neutrality and non-nuclear. And both are, of course, I mean, in a certain sense, subject to questioning now by some. I think I don't see a rapid change in Austria on this subject, but I do see, and because we spoke about Versailles, a very interesting reaction to one of the messages of the Versailles summit, because the Versailles summit spoke about the mutual defense clause that is in the European Union Treaty, and said that this is a sign of solidarity to all Europeans, whether they are allied or non-allied. And obviously, this was a message which was followed with great interest, and I think also accepted in a very positive spirit within Austria. But the one point that I would make, and that is a discussion that we Austrians have to have amongst ourselves, mutual assistance and solidarity is never a one-way street. It is always reciprocal, and I think that we will have to have a reflection of our own, how we see our commitments in this context.
Darius, briefly, solidarity and resilience. Do you see Europe maintaining the level of solidarity and resilience that it is showing now?
It's not possible, and it's necessary. Because if we don't maintain the resilience and solidarity, you may see some EU members simply collapse under the burden, and then the crisis will double. So this is both necessary and possible. But let me, my final word is to mention that when we are speaking here, at least some 6,000 people have crossed the border of Ukraine and entered its neighbors. So it shows the urgency of any decision to be made. It must be made quickly.
Serhii, final word goes to you. As everyone has said, and most recently Thomas, the preservation of your Ukrainian statehood, of the Ukrainian nation, and thus of Ukrainian people is paramount, I think, in the minds of everyone. Nobody suspected that Russia would challenge the existence of a sovereign European state that sits at the United Nations, that has European aspirations clearly defined and shown since the Orange Revolution, since the Maidan, which Putin sees as a coup d'etat, and thus we see his flaunted way of seeing the world. How do you see this moving forward? Do you expect that this will drag on, or do you think we're looking at a possible solution?
Yeah. Well, you're absolutely right. No one expected that kind of war with that kind of goals of really removing the country and the nation from the map of Europe, from the map of history. But also no one expected that Ukrainians would last for more than 2 days. There was a lot of different interpretation between Washington and Moscow on everything, except that there was a consensus that the war would not last for more than 2 or 3 days. And Ukrainians showed the sort of solidarity and resilience that we are now talking about in terms of Europe. And for me, this first 2 or 3 days, and then additional, now 24 days, is a very clear sign that Ukrainians as a nation are there to stay. So if anything, in historical terms, it's stronger today than it was 1 month ago. So I'm very optimistic about Ukraine's long-term future, about Ukraine's place in Europe. If anything, again, this month made that belief of mine stronger than before. The question is what will happen tomorrow, what will happen next week, what will happen next month. And again, I'm more optimistic now than I was at the beginning of the war. Ukrainians showed the ability to defend. Europe showed the ability to unite and help and assist and not collapse and not cave in. But I really, no matter how I wish, I can't imagine a scenario where the war will stop soon, where there will be no more victims, including civilian victims. But the more resistance, the more unity, the shorter will be the war.
I think many have underestimated the national liberation struggles over the long range of history and the desire to preserve one's freedom. No need to mention Vietnam or Algeria or Ukraine now. I did not underestimate that because we in our country were ready to fight the Soviet Union. Were they to attack Yugoslavia after the invasion of Czechoslovakia, there was a determination. So I fully understand this desire. So this is really a battle between freedom and tyranny. Please join me in thanking the panel, Stand with Ukraine.